The trail signs were all facing the wrong direction, and none of them had been touched the day before when I checked them. I noticed it about 20 minutes into my patrol, right where the junction splits toward the canyon overlook, because the arrow that should have pointed east was turned completely backward, aimed into a dense patch of trees where there wasn't even a footpath. At first, I thought it was just vandalism, which happens sometimes, but then I saw the next sign, and the next one after that, all rotated just slightly off, not random, but deliberate. Like someone had adjusted each one to create a new route that didn't actually exist. I radioed it in, logged the first marker, and started correcting them as I went, turning each sign back to its proper orientation and tightening the bolts with a tool I carry for maintenance. Dispatch acknowledged, told me to document everything, and asked if I had seen anyone in the area. I said negative, which was true. The trail had been empty all morning, no hikers, no vehicles in the lot except my own. That was unusual for a clear day, but not unheard of. I moved on, fixing signs one by one, until I reached a section where the trail narrowed and dipped into a shaded corridor of tall pines. That's where things started to feel off. The signs there weren't just turned, they had been repositioned entirely, pulled from their posts and stuck into the ground at odd angles. Some pointing straight down, others leaning against trees. It would have taken time to do that, and effort, and I hadn't heard or seen anyone. I crouched to inspect one of the posts and noticed the bolts were missing, not loosened, but completely removed. I scanned the ground and found them neatly placed in a small pile a few feet away, like someone had taken care not to lose them. I radioed dispatch again, updated the situation, and this time there was a slight delay before they responded, like they were conferring with someone else. When they came back, they asked me to continue documenting, but not to proceed deeper until another unit could join me. I acknowledged, but I was already standing in that section, and pulling back without understanding what was going on didn't feel right. I decided to move forward slowly, staying alert, keeping the radio close. About 50 yards ahead, I found the first real sign that someone had been actively manipulating the trail beyond just signs. Branches had been cut and laid across the actual path in a way that made it look less traveled, while a false path had been cleared to the side, leading into thicker woods. The false path looked convincing at a glance: freshly disturbed soil, broken twigs, even a few footprints to sell it. I stepped carefully, checking the prints, and noticed they were all the same size, same pattern, repeated over and over in a way that didn't match natural walking. That made me pause. I called it in again, told dispatch it looked like someone was intentionally redirecting foot traffic, and they told me to hold position, that a second ranger was on the way. I agreed, but before I could step back, I heard something behind me, a faint crunch of gravel from the direction I had just come. I turned quickly, expecting to see the other ranger arriving early, but the trail behind me was empty. No movement, no sound after that initial step. I called out, identified myself, but got no response. I stood there for a few seconds, listening, and then my radio crackled. Instead of dispatch, I heard my own voice, repeating the last thing I had just said, slightly delayed and distorted. I froze, staring at the radio, and asked dispatch if they had just transmitted that back to me. They responded immediately, sounding confused, said they hadn't repeated anything, and asked me to confirm my status. I told them I was fine, but something wasn't right with the channel. They suggested switching frequencies, so I did, but the moment I changed over, the static got worse, and then I heard a different voice, low and unfamiliar, saying, "Keep going." I switched back instantly, my heart starting to pick up. Dispatch asked what happened, and I told them I was experiencing interference, possibly from another unauthorized radio. They said they would try to triangulate the source, but it might take time. I looked back at the false path, then at the real one, and made the decision to continue along the actual trail, not the one someone had created. As I moved forward, I started marking my path more carefully, tying small strips of tape at eye level so I could clearly see my route back. The forest grew denser, the light dimmer, and the air felt still. After a few minutes, I came across another odd detail, one of my own tape markers, already placed ahead of me, tied in the exact same way I had been doing it. I stopped immediately, staring at it, trying to understand how it could be there when I hadn't passed that point yet. I checked my previous markers behind me. They were still in place, exactly where I had left them. This one was new, fresh, and in front of me. I radioed dispatch again, explained what I was seeing, and they told me to stop moving, to wait for backup. But their voice was cutting in and out again, making it hard to follow. I decided to take a few steps closer to the marker, just to confirm it wasn't something I had missed earlier. As I did, I noticed something else. Faint impressions in the soil beside the trail, like footprints, but not in a straight line, more like someone had been pacing back and forth, repeatedly crossing the same small area. I crouched down, examined them, and realized they were fresh, edges still sharp, and they overlapped in a way that suggested continuous movement rather than a single pass. I stood up slowly, scanning the surrounding trees, and that's when I saw it. A brief flicker of movement between two trunks, low to the ground, gone almost as soon as I focused on it. I called out again, louder this time, but there was no answer. My radio buzzed, and I heard dispatch saying my name, asking if I was still there, but it sounded distant, like the signal was weakening. I responded, told them I had possible visual on someone in the area, but I couldn't confirm. They told me to hold position again, that the second ranger was close. I stayed where I was, not moving forward or back, just listening. After a few seconds, I heard it again, that crunch of gravel, but this time it was to my left, off the trail, followed by another step, and then another, moving slowly, deliberately. I turned toward the sound, trying to see through the trees, but the underbrush was too thick. Then the footsteps stopped, and the forest went completely quiet again. I raised my radio, about to speak, when I heard my name come from ahead of me, not through the radio, but from the direction of the false path I had ignored earlier. It was my voice, or something very close to it, calling out softly. I didn't respond. I just stood there, trying to process it. The voice came again, a little louder, repeating my name, and then saying, "This way." I took a step back instead, toward the real trail, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the trail signs I had fixed earlier, which should have been behind me, was now ahead, mounted on a different post, pointing directly into the false path. I knew I hadn't passed it again. I knew exactly where it had been. I backed up another step, then another, keeping my eyes on that sign, and I saw it shift slightly, just a small movement, like it had been recently adjusted. My radio crackled again, and this time I heard the other ranger's voice coming through, clear and steady, calling my call sign and asking for my location. I responded immediately, relief hitting me, and gave him my coordinates. He said he was about 2 minutes out. I told him to stay on the main trail and not to follow any altered signs. As I waited, the voice from the woods stopped, and the forest remained still. A minute later, I heard actual footsteps on the trail behind me, and when I turned, I saw the other ranger coming into view, moving quickly but controlled. I signaled him over, and together we moved back toward the trailhead, not stopping to fix any more signs. When we returned later with a larger team, the trail markers were all back in their original positions, bolts secure, no signs of tampering. The false path was gone, the branches cleared, the ground undisturbed, like it had never existed. We searched the area thoroughly, documented everything, but found no evidence of who had done it or how. The report was filed as suspected vandalism, though no one could explain the timeline or the radio interference. I still patrol that section occasionally, and most days it looks completely normal. But sometimes, when I pass that junction, I catch myself checking the direction of the signs more than once, because the last time I went through there alone, I found one arrow turned just slightly off again, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that if you followed it without thinking, you'd end up walking straight into the trees, exactly where I heard my own voice telling me to go. The emergency call came from inside a closed section of the park that no one had access to, and the voice on the line was asking for a ranger by name who had retired 3 years earlier. I was on desk rotation when it came through, monitoring radio traffic and logging patrol check-ins, when dispatch flagged it and patched the audio over to my station. The connection was weak, full of distortion, but you could still make out the urgency in the man's voice as he repeated the same sentence over and over, asking for Ranger D. Harlow, and giving coordinates that landed deep inside a restricted burn zone that had been sealed off since a wildfire the previous season. The problem was, Harlow hadn't worked here in years, and the burn zone was still considered unstable. No public access, no active permits, nothing. I asked dispatch to confirm the source of the call, and they said it was coming from a handheld radio frequency, not a phone, which made it even stranger because we didn't issue radios to civilians. I listened to the recording again, and something about the way the core inconceivable feels off, like they were being read from memory but slightly misaligned, a digit or two out of place. I checked the system and found that the location he was describing didn't match any active trail, but it did line up with an old service road that had been decommissioned after the fire. I signed out immediately, grabbed a field kit and headed out alone because the closest available unit was over an hour away. As I drove toward the access gate, I kept replaying the voice in my head, trying to place it, but it didn't match anyone I recognized from staff or regulars. The gate itself was still locked, chain intact, no signs of tampering, and the surrounding fence line was undisturbed. I logged my entry, cut the chain with bolt cutters we keep for emergency access, and drove in slowly, the tires crunching over ash and loose gravel. The landscape inside was still scarred from the fire, blackened trunks, sparse regrowth, and a smell that never fully goes away. About a mile in, I lost cell signal completely, which I expected, but my radio still had partial coverage, enough to stay in contact with dispatch, though the connection wasn't stable. I updated them with my position and told them I was proceeding to the coordinates given in the call. They acknowledged, but there was a slight delay, like the signal was bouncy. As I followed the old service road, I started noticing small markers along the edge, not official ones, but pieces of reflective material tied to branches at irregular intervals. They caught the light just enough to be visible if you were looking for them, but they weren't placed in any logical pattern. I slowed down, rolled the window down, and listened, but the area was quiet, except for the engine and the occasional crack of cooling wood. About 10 minutes later, my radio crackled, and I heard the same voice from the recording, clearer this time, calling out again for Ranger Harlow and repeating the coordinates, but now adding a phrase at the end, "I'm still here." I immediately called dispatch, asked if they had just transmitted that, and they said negative, they hadn't sent anything. I asked if they were hearing the same thing, and they said they only heard static on my channel. That's when I realized the signal wasn't coming through dispatch at all. It was coming directly to my unit. I checked the frequency, confirmed it was the same one we used for internal communication, and that meant someone out there had access to our channel. I continued driving, following the road as it curved deeper into the burn zone, and the reflective markers became more frequent, almost like they were guiding me somewhere. I considered turning back, waiting for backup, but the voice had sounded urgent, and if someone was actually out there, injured or trapped, I couldn't ignore it. This kind of situation happens more often than people think, where a call doesn't line up with official records, but still turns out to be real. About half a mile from the coordinates, I saw something ahead on the road, a vehicle parked at an angle, partially blocking the path. I slowed to a stop about 20 yards back and got out, scanning the area before approaching. The vehicle was an older model SUV, covered in a thin layer of ash, windows intact, doors closed. I checked the plates and ran them through my radio, but the response from dispatch was broken, only partial numbers coming through. I approached the driver's side and looked inside. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position, and there was a folded map on the passenger seat, along with a handheld radio unit that looked similar to the one we issued years ago, but not a current model. I opened the door carefully, checked for any immediate signs of struggle, but everything looked undisturbed. I picked up the radio, and as soon as I did, it emitted a short burst of static, followed by that same voice, now much closer, saying, "You are almost here." I dropped it back onto the seat immediately and stepped away, my pulse picking up. I radioed dispatch again, reported the vehicle, the radio, the voice, and asked for immediate backup. But the response came back delayed and fragmented, like they were having trouble receiving my transmission. I gave them my coordinates again, louder this time, and they confirmed units were en route but still at least 40 minutes out. I didn't want to stay by the vehicle, not with that radio sitting there, so I moved past it on foot, following the direction the road led, which aligned with the coordinates. The ground was uneven, patches of ash giving way to exposed dirt, and that's when I started noticing footprints, fresh ones, leading off the road into a cluster of burned trees. They were deep, uneven, like the person had been moving quickly or struggling to keep balance. I followed them cautiously, marking my path as I went, and after about 50 yards, I reached a small depression in the terrain, almost like a shallow pit where the fire had burned hotter than the surrounding area. In the center of it, there was a collapsed structure, maybe the remains of an old shed or storage unit, mostly reduced to charred beams and twisted metal. The footprints led directly to it and stopped at the edge. I called out, identified myself, asked if anyone was there, but there was no response. My radio crackled again, and this time I heard a different voice, quieter, almost whispering, repeating my own last transmission back to me, slightly distorted. I turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. I stepped closer to the collapsed structure, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily, and that's when I saw it. A small opening beneath one of the beams, just large enough for someone to crawl into. I knelt down, shined my flashlight inside, and saw a narrow space beneath the debris, dark but not completely blocked. I called out again, louder this time, and waited. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard a faint response, a voice from inside, weak but clear, saying my name, not my call sign, my actual name. I felt a chill run through me because there was no reason anyone out there should know it. I asked them to identify themselves, but the response was just my name again, followed by a soft scraping sound. I backed up slightly, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. I radioed dispatch, told them I had possible contact with a person trapped under debris, but the reply came back garbled, only fragments getting through. I looked back at the opening, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement inside, like a shadow shifting, but it was too dark to be sure. I grabbed a longer branch from nearby and used it to gently probe the opening, not wanting to put my hands inside without knowing what I was dealing with. As the branch moved the debris slightly, the voice came again, louder this time, urgent, calling my name repeatedly, faster and faster, until it started to overlap with itself, like multiple recordings playing at once. I dropped the branch and stepped back, my heart pounding now, because that wasn't how a trapped person would sound. I looked around again, scanning the surrounding trees, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Small devices attached to several of the charred trunks, partially hidden by ash, each one about the size of a matchbox, with tiny speakers facing outward. They were spaced in a rough circle around the depression. My radio crackled again, and I heard the original voice, the one asking for Ranger Harlow, now saying he didn't come either. That's when it clicked that this wasn't a random emergency. This was set up, designed to draw someone in using a name that might trigger a response. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the opening and the surrounding trees, and started moving back toward the road. As I did, the voices continued, shifting between my name, Harlow's name, and other phrases I couldn't fully make out, all coming from different directions now. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. I reached the road, got back to my vehicle, and drove straight out of the burn zone, not stopping until I was back at the gate. Backup units arrived shortly after, and I led them back in, But when we reached the location of the SUV, it was gone. No tire tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate it had ever been there. We continued to the depression, but the devices were gone too, along with any clear footprints. The only thing left was the collapsed structure and the opening beneath it, which now looked smaller than I remembered. They searched the area thoroughly, documented everything, but found no trace of who had set it up or where they had gone. The case was logged as a false emergency with unknown origin, and the report was filed away. A few days later, I looked into Ranger Harlow's records out of curiosity, and I found that the last call he ever responded to before retiring had been in that same burn zone, just weeks before the fire. And it was logged as an incomplete response with no details attached, just a note that he had entered the area and then returned without filing a full report. And sometimes I still think about that voice saying, "He didn't come either," and wonder if the coordinates were never meant to lead to a rescue at all, but to see who would show up when they heard a name they recognized. The flagged area wasn't supposed to be there, and none of us had logged it, but there it was on the ridge map like it had always existed. I remember Carter pointing at it first, tapping the GPS screen with the back of his glove, asking if either of us had entered a restricted zone update that morning, and both me and Alvarez shook our heads at the same time. We had just finished a routine boundary patrol, nothing unusual, just checking fire break lines and replacing 2 weathered trail markers, when Carter noticed the new polygon on the digital map. Shaded in red with a generic hazard label and no description attached. That alone was enough to make us stop, because restricted zones don't just appear without a briefing, especially not in that section of the park. I radioed dispatch, gave them our coordinates and asked for confirmation on any recent updates, but the response came back delayed and vague, something about a possible mapping error and instructions to visually verify conditions. That wasn't standard wording, and Alvarez gave me a look that said he caught it too. We decided to approach it anyway, because if there was an actual hazard out there, we needed to know what it was. The terrain shifted as we moved closer, the trees growing tighter together, the ground uneven with old root systems pushing through the soil, and the air felt noticeably cooler, even though it was winting. Mid-afternoon. About 10 minutes in, we started seeing small strips of yellow survey tape tied low around tree trunks, not at eye level like usual, but closer to the ground, almost like someone wanted to mark a path without it being obvious. Carter crouched to inspect one and pointed out that the tape was newer than anything we'd put up. No fading, no fraying, and it was tied in a knot we didn't use in training. I logged the detail and snapped a photo. Then we kept following the line of tape as it led deeper into the woods. The forest went quiet in that way it does sometimes, where even the wind seems to pull back, and every sound you make feels louder than it should. After another few minutes, we reached a small clearing that didn't match anything on our maps, a roughly circular patch where the underbrush had been cleared away, leaving bare soil with a strange pattern of shallow trenches cut into it, forming a loose grid. Alvarez stepped closer and said it looked like someone had been digging, but not for anything specific, more like they were measuring or mapping the ground itself. In the center of the clearing, there was a large shape covered with a dark green tarp, weighed down at the corners with stones. It was about 6 feet long, maybe 3 feet wide, and low to the ground, like whatever was underneath it had been deliberately flattened. We all stopped at the edge of the clearing, just looking at it for a second, because none of us recognized it as standard equipment or anything that should have been out there. I radioed dispatch again, described what we were seeing, but the reply came back with heavy static, only a few words getting through. Something about hold position and do not disturb, though I couldn't tell if that was actually what they said or just what it sounded like. Carter suggested we circle the clearing first, check for any signs of recent activity, so we spread out slightly, keeping the tarp-covered shape in view. As I moved along the perimeter, I noticed boot prints in the dirt, at least 2 distinct patterns, both recent, leading in and out of the clearing, but they didn't follow a consistent path. more like someone had been pacing or moving around randomly. There were also drag marks near the edge, shallow but noticeable, like something heavy had been pulled a short distance and then repositioned. I called that out, and Alvarez said he was seeing the same thing on his side. Carter, who was closest to the tarp, knelt down and pointed at one corner where the fabric had been slightly disturbed, like it had been lifted and then set back down. He didn't touch it yet, just looked back at us and asked if we should wait for confirmation from dispatch. I checked the radio again, tried to get a clear response, but all I got was a burst of static, followed by a clipped tone I didn't recognize. That's when we heard it, a faint rustling sound from inside the tarp. Not loud, just enough to make all three of us freeze at the same time. We looked at each other, and without saying it out loud, we all understood that whatever was under there wasn't supposed to be moving. Carter slowly reached out with the end of his trekking pole and nudged the tarp near the edge, just enough to shift it slightly. The fabric moved, and for a second, the shape underneath shifted, and then the shape underneath shifted in response, subtle but undeniable, like something adjusting its position. Alvarez swore under his breath and stepped back, and I felt my grip tighten on the radio. I called dispatch again, more urgently this time, telling them we had possible human presence under a covered object, requesting immediate backup, but the line stayed dead for a few seconds before a voice came through, not the usual dispatcher, just saying, "Leave it," in a flat tone, then cutting out. Carter looked at me and asked if that was official, and I shook my head because it didn't sound like anyone we worked with. We stood there for another moment, trying to decide what to do, and then the tarp moved again, more noticeably this time, the center lifting slightly before settling back down. It wasn't a wind shift. There was no breeze, and the movement had direction, like something inside had pushed upward, and then stopped. Alvarez took a step back toward the tree line and said we needed to get out of the clearing, reassess from a distance, and I agreed, but Carter hesitated, eyes still fixed on the tarp, like he was trying to process what he was seeing. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back a few steps, and that seemed to snap him out of it. As we moved toward the edge of the clearing, I noticed something else that hadn't been there before. A fresh set of prints leading from the tarp toward the opposite side, deeper and more defined than the others. Like whatever had made them was heavier or had shifted weight suddenly. I pointed it out, and Alvarez said he hadn't seen those earlier. We backed away together, keeping our eyes on the tarp, and that's when it happened again. A slow, deliberate movement from underneath, the entire shape shifting a few inches to one side, dragging slightly against the ground before stopping. None of us spoke for a second, because there was no easy explanation for that. We reached the tree line and stopped, putting some cover between us and the clearing, and I tried the radio again, switching channels, adjusting the antenna, but every frequency gave me the same broken response, fragments of words and static. Carter suggested we mark the location and pull back to higher ground where the signal might be better, and we all agreed that was the safest move. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the clearing, and I saw something that made me pause. The tarp had shifted just enough at one corner to expose a small section underneath, and what I could see didn't look like equipment or supplies. It looked like layered material, like fabric or clothing, tightly packed and compressed. I didn't get a better look because Alvarez called out that we needed to move, and I followed, but that image stuck with me as we made our way back up the ridge. It's not something we like to admit, but situations like that don't always get reported the way they happen, especially when there's no clear category to file them under. We reached a higher point about 15 minutes later, and finally got a clear signal. I contacted dispatch, gave them a full report, and this time the response was immediate and professional, like nothing had been wrong with the connection earlier. They told us to hold position and wait for a response team, which arrived about an hour later. When we led them back to the clearing, the tarp was gone. Not moved, not shifted, gone completely, along with any sign that it had ever been there. The grid of shallow trenches was still visible, but the center was empty, the ground smoothed over in a way that didn't match the rest of the clearing. The boot prints we had seen earlier were partially erased, like someone had deliberately scuffed them out, and the Drag marks were no longer visible. The response team searched the area thoroughly, expanded the perimeter, and documented what remained, but they didn't find anything that explained what we had seen. We filed our reports separately, compared notes, and everything matched. The tarp, the movement, the voice on the radio, all of it. A few days later, I checked the digital map again, and the restricted zone was gone. No record of it ever being added. I brought it up with a supervisor, and they said it must have been a software glitch, nothing to worry about. But the part that still bothers me is something Carter mentioned when we were going over the details one last time. He said that when he nudged the tarp with his pole, he felt resistance, like whatever was underneath had pushed back slightly before settling again. And I didn't think much of it at the time. But later, when I reviewed the photos I had taken in the clearing, I noticed that in the background of one image, just beyond where the tarp had been, there was a faint line of impressions leading into the trees, evenly spaced, like footprints, but deeper than any we had seen, and they started exactly where the tarp had been lying.